This video was filmed moments before three members of the Nelon family and their friends boarded the aircraft behind them for a routine flight. Unfortunately, something went terribly wrong and they crashed, but the truth is this is not a picture of their wreckage. However, the story behind this image is very shocking and tragic, and how it relates to the Nelons plane crash is the one thing that no one has said about this tragedy. That's why I'm going to explain what happened and how these two stories are connected. I'm Hoover, and welcome to your pilot debrief. Jason, Kelly, and Amber Nelon were part of the Southern Gospel music group, the Nelons. If you haven't heard of them before, the Nelons are in the Gospel Music Association Hall of Fame and have won multiple awards over the years. Jason Clark was 50 years old, and he's the one that recorded this video moments before the flight. Traveling with him was his wife, 64-year-old Kelly Nelon Clark. Kelly had been a singer for over 45 years and won a Lifetime Achievement Award in 2017. On the morning of the flight, Kelly posted to social media saying she was up for an early flight to Seattle and praying for a good, smooth flight and no storms. Amber was only 35 years old, and she was also on the plane, and she's Kelly's daughter from a previous marriage. Amber was also a singer and won an award for Female Vocalist of the Year in 2014. Traveling with the Nelons was Amber's husband, 34-year-old Nathan Kistler. Also on board was family friend and the band's assistant, 53-year-old Melody Hodges, as well as 65-year-old Melissa Haney and her husband, 67-year-old Larry Haney, who was the pilot flying the plane, but we'll talk more about him in a minute. First of all, I want to say that I know this is a sensitive topic because there are families and friends that are still dealing with this tragedy, especially Kelly's other daughter, Autumn, who was a fourth member of the Nelons. Autumn wasn't on the plane because she decided to take a different flight, and in one day, she essentially lost her entire family. That's why I want to do my best to be respectful and focus on the facts while still sharing some of the lessons we can learn to prevent future mishaps. I'm going to warn you though, if you think the Nelon story is tragic, just wait until you find out what happened to this other family in the second half of our story. This is the Bramlage family. Ron, Becky, and their 4 children all died when their plane crashed just 30 minutes after takeoff. It just so happened to be the same kind of plane the Nelons were flying in, and the investigation into the Bramlage family crash revealed several shocking details that connect these two stories. And my heart and prayers go out to the family and friends of these victims in both of these terrible tragedies. For now, when it comes to the Nelons, the NTSB still has a long way to go with their investigation, and one of the first things they're going to look at is the pilot flying the plane. Larry Haney was the pilot flying the aircraft the Nelons were on. Larry began his career in law enforcement in the 1970s, and he was a successful business owner who also served as chairman of the board for the Georgia Department of Corrections and was also very active in his local church. I think it's important to understand that Larry and his wife had 2 children. Their son Jared died in 2006 at the age of 19 in a motorcycle accident, and one of the tragic parts of this story that no one has really talked about yet is that Larry's daughter Larissa was only 41 years old when she died just 9 days prior to the plane crash that killed Larry and his wife. Larry and his wife seem to be in good spirits in this video just before the flight, but it's hard to imagine outliving both of your children, and I'm sure it was likely on his mind. I want to be clear though, because I'm not trying to say that this was the reason for the crash. I know this is hard to talk about, but I think it's important to bring up because we're all human, and it's possible that maybe this was just one slice in the Swiss cheese model. I don't know if I would be 100% ready to fly less than 2 weeks after I buried my daughter, but everyone processes grief differently, and if you're a pilot, it's up to you to make that decision for yourself. I think we just need to keep in mind that this story highlights just how fragile life is, and you never know what tomorrow might bring. For now, according to the FAA, Larry had a private pilot certificate issued in 2011 with single and multi-engine aircraft ratings as well as an instrument rating. We don't know how many total flight hours or how much experience he had, but the aircraft he was flying was a 2010 Pilatus PC-12 that Larry owned, and it was registered to Haney Enterprises since 2014. My guess is Larry had a decent amount of experience flying the PC-12 because the history shows it was being flown several times a month out of his home airport. One of the most important things you need to know about the PC-12 is that it's certified as a single pilot aircraft, and that means Larry didn't need a second pilot with him on the flight. Now I want to be clear though when I tell you that what I'm about to say is not an opinion about Larry. The thing is, pilots need to understand that just because you can fly an aircraft single pilot, that doesn't always mean it's a good idea. The PC-12 is a complex, high-performance aircraft with a pressurized cabin and retractable gear, and one of the reasons it's approved for single-pilot operations is because the avionics and the automation make all of that manageable for just one person. However, the danger is that can lead to complacency and an over-reliance on the automation to fly the aircraft for you. That's why it's so important to know your limits and don't be afraid to ask another pilot to fly with you if you need to. When it comes to the aircraft itself, the PC-12 is very reliable, but we still don't know if there was anything mechanically wrong with the aircraft that contributed to the Nelons crash. All we have right now is the flight data, so we're going to look at that next, and then I'm going to explain what happened to the Bramlage family and how these two stories are connected. On July 26, 2024, the Nelon family and friends boarded the plane at the Nebraska City Municipal Airport for their flight to the Billings Airport in Montana. The weather at both airports was mostly clear skies. However, there was a cold front that would impact their route of flight. And even though we don't have more details on that right now, my gut tells me there's a good chance it's going to play a role in what happened. The Air Safety Institute shared this graphic in a video they made about the tragedy, and it shows there was an airmet issued for possible moderate turbulence in the area where the Nelons crashed from flight level 280 up to flight level 420. However, it's important to keep in mind that according to the flight data, the Nelons were flying at 26,000 feet when their problems first started, so it's hard to know how much of a role turbulence played in this tragedy. If you look at the profile view of the flight, it appeared that Larry was using the autopilot for most of the trip. They climbed up to 24,000 feet and stayed at that altitude for about an hour before climbing up to 26,000 feet. I used the ADS-B data from the aircraft to recreate the final moments of the flight. We know that Larry was at 26,000 feet and was most likely using the autopilot when for some reason the autopilot became disconnected. When that happened, Larry began a climbing right-hand turn. The number on the far right side of the screen shows you the aircraft vertical rate of climb or descent in feet per minute, and Larry initially climbed to an altitude of about 26,500 feet. Now, I don't want to speculate about how this happened or what Larry should be doing right now, because we have no idea what's going on inside the aircraft, and the NTSB hasn't finished their investigation. We can see, though, that as Larry continued the right-hand turn, he's eventually going to transition to a descent at a rate of about 2,000 to 3,000 feet per minute. At some point after the autopilot disconnected, according to multiple sources, Larry made a radio call to air traffic control saying that he was trying to get control of the aircraft, but we don't have any further details on that. During this first turn, the aircraft descended to about 25,200 feet, and then what's interesting is that it immediately began a very aggressive climb at about 5,000 to 6,000 feet per minute. And the truth is that if Larry's in the weather right now, then this can be very disorienting and very dangerous. On the left side, you can see the airspeed is going to rapidly decay, but keep in mind that this is ground speed, which can be very different than the aircraft indicated airspeed, because ground speed takes into consideration the winds at the altitude the aircraft is at. The aircraft slowed down to about 130 knots and eventually reached a maximum altitude of 27,400 feet before beginning a left-hand turn. And this is where things start to really get out of control, because it transitioned back to a descent at a rate of at least 10,000 feet per minute and started to turn back to the right. You can see the airspeed is going to rapidly increase during that turn, and then I'm not sure how valid some of the flight data is here at the end, because the data jumps around a little bit and then it stops. Typically, this happens when an aircraft breaks apart in flight, and according to local authorities, they reported the debris was spread over a wide area, so unfortunately, it's just a very tragic situation. And now that you understand a little bit more about what happened to the Nelons, we need to talk about the Bramlage family, because as far as I know, no one else has talked about how these two stories are connected. These are images from the wreckage of the Bramlage family plane crash. Ron, Becky, and their 4 kids had just finished a vacation in the Bahamas, and they flew to Fort Pierce, Florida to go through customs, and everything seemed to be going fine. However, a few hours later, they took off to head home to Kansas, and tragically, they crashed about 30 minutes after takeoff. Ron was 45 years old, and he was the pilot. And according to the investigation, he logged his very first flight in February of 1994, and he would then go on to fly a variety of single-engine piston aircraft and eventually got his instrument rating in 1997. Over the course of the next 7 years, from 1997 until 2004, he logged only 28 hours of actual instrument flight time. That's about 4 hours a year, and it's not enough to maintain proficiency. The other thing you need to know about Ron's background is that his first known flight in a turbine engine aircraft was in 2009 when he logged 7.5 hours as dual received in a Piper PA-46 Malibu Meridian. This means he flew with an instructor, but nothing was signed off by a flight instructor in his logbook. Unfortunately, there aren't any flights in Ron's logbook after that for the next 3 years, until April 30th, 2012, when Ron decided to go out and purchase a 2006 Pilatus PC-12 so he could take his family on a vacation to the Bahamas. In order to learn how to fly the PC-12, Ron hired a flight instructor for one flight to take the plane with him out to Arizona where he could get some training. Ron attended ground school and conducted flights over the course of a 10-day period, acquiring roughly 19 hours of flight time, of which 3.6 hours were in actual instrument conditions. While he was at training, Ron was paired up with another pilot named Tim, who was a retired airline captain with over 21,000 hours of flight time. According to Tim, he felt that Ron was behind the aircraft during training. One time, Ron failed to retract the landing gear on takeoff. Another time, he flew through his clearance of 1,500 feet. And when it came to flying approaches, Tim didn't detect any improvement from Ron during training. As training was coming to an end, Ron mentioned that he was planning to fly his family to the Bahamas, and Tim suggested that he get another pilot to fly with him and that he might want to get more comfortable in the aircraft before making the trip. Tim also told Ron that despite the fact that he was a retired airline captain, he was going to go get more dual instruction before flying solo in a PC-12. Basically, he was trying to warn Ron that just because you're legal to do something, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea. Instead of following Tim's advice, over the next few weeks, Ron logged 8.5 more hours of single pilot flight time in the aircraft, but only 0.2 hours of that was in actual instrument conditions. By the time Ron took off for the Bahamas, even though he had about 755 hours of total flight time, he only had about 45 hours in turbine engine airplanes, with about 38 hours in the PC-12 and less than 4 hours of actual instrument flight time in the last 8 years. The flights from Kansas down to the Bahamas and then back to Florida were uneventful, and my guess is those two flights further reinforced Ron's belief that he could handle the aircraft by himself and everyone was safe. As they got ready to leave Florida, we know that Ron filed an IFR flight plan, but there's no evidence that he got an official weather briefing before taking off. If he had, he might have been warned about the storms moving across the state of Florida. Instead, he took off, and about 2 minutes after getting airborne, the controller warned him about an area of moderate to heavy precipitation 15 miles in front of him that was about 30 miles wide. Ron said thank you and was then switched to the next controller. 4 minutes later, Ron was warned again about the storms in front of him. However, this time he asked if he needed to go around the weather, and the controller cleared him to deviate north. According to the flight data, Ron made no attempt to deviate around the weather, and instead he continued on a northwest heading until the controller cleared him to climb to flight level 260. This was the exact same altitude that the Nelons were at when their pilot began to lose control of the aircraft. 10 seconds later, the controller warned Ron again about the storm system off his nose and asked him to take a look at it and recommended he deviate to the right to go north of the weather. Ron agreed and requested a fly heading of 320, and the controller approved that and also cleared him to deviate further right if necessary. Unfortunately, that would be the last radio call that Ron would acknowledge. About 4 seconds later, the autopilot disconnected when the aircraft was in a shallow climb just above 25,000 feet, with the airspeed indicating about 109 knots and a right bank of less than 25 degrees. As soon as the autopilot disconnected, he needed to recognize what was happening, roll wings level, and fly the aircraft first, then worry about the autopilot later. Instead, Ron allowed the situation to get worse, and the bank angle continued to increase to 50 degrees, and the aircraft kept descending. 13 seconds after the autopilot disconnected, instead of flying the aircraft, Ron decided to conduct a test of the autopilot system. The only reason I can imagine him doing this is because he was in the weather and he was so disoriented that he didn't even realize how dangerous the situation was, and he probably assumed the autopilot would save him. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. The aircraft continued to spiral towards the ground during that test, and over the next 20 seconds, the bank angle increased to as much as 100 degrees. Passing through 15,500 feet, the airspeed reached as high as 338 knots, which was about 175 knots above the maximum operating maneuvering speed. It was at this point Ron probably realized they were out of control. And because of how fast they were going, when he pulled back on the controls, it generated a load factor of 4.6 times the force of gravity, resulting in the overstress and fracture of the wings, and the aircraft broke apart in flight. It was later determined that the autopilot passed the in-flight test and there was nothing wrong with the system. The worst part about this entire story, though, is that after the right wing broke off, it impacted and breached the fuselage, causing one of the children to be ejected from the aircraft. Tragically, he wouldn't be found until 26 hours after the crash. Even though Ron might have been legal to operate the aircraft he was flying, there was no reason he should have. In my opinion, if you can afford to buy a PC-12, you can afford to hire a well-qualified pilot to fly with you to the Bahamas until you gain enough experience to fly by yourself. Instead, Ron assumed that he could make the trip safely, despite being behind the aircraft in training and having been warned by his training partner not to do it. When it comes to the Nelons, there's still a lot we don't know, and we have to be careful not to speculate. That's why I want to be clear when I say that the point of this video isn't to make any sort of comparison between Larry and Ron. One of the things that no one has said about the Nelons plane crash is how similar it is to the Bramlage family crash, and the reason I share both of these stories is because they both involved PC-12 aircraft conducting single-pilot operations, flying with the autopilot around 25,000 feet when something caused the autopilot to disconnect. Both pilots struggled to regain control of the aircraft, and they both ended up in a steep dive where the airspeed got out of control and the aircraft broke apart in flight. Unfortunately, the NTSB was never able to determine the reason why the autopilot disconnected during Ron's flight, and the truth is that we might not find out for another year or two what really caused the Nelon family plane crash. If you want to learn about one of the other deadliest PC-12 crashes in history and the pilot's reckless decisions that caused it, then be sure to watch this video on the screen, and thanks for your support.